Compass of the Heart. New York, 1922. Margaret Calloway had always heard the steady ticking of James Calloway's watch, even though it had been broken for years. But tonight it suddenly stopped. She checked the time, exactly midnight. And then, from the darkness, a voice murmured her name. Chapter 1. Midnight and the Silent Watch. The brownstone on East 20th Street stood silent, a stark monolith against the backdrop of a slumbering New York City. Inside, Margaret Calloway sat in the dimly lit parlor, the only sound the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a somber metronome marking the passage of time, a time that had felt both agonizingly slow and fleetingly swift since James's death 4 years ago. In her lap lay his watch, a heavy, silver timepiece with intricate engravings of oak leaves and acorns. It had stopped working during the war, a victim of the same shrapnel blast that had nearly claimed James's life in the Argonne forest. He'd survived that day, but the watch hadn't. Yet for Margaret, it had never truly stopped ticking. She heard it, a faint, phantom rhythm in the quiet of the house, a comforting echo of the man she had loved and lost. Tonight, however, was different. As the grandfather clock chimed midnight, a profound silence descended. It wasn't just the absence of the city's muffled roar, it was the silence within the silence, the abrupt cessation of that familiar, internal tick. Margaret held the watch to her ear, her heart constricting with a sudden, inexplicable dread. Nothing. The watch face, illuminated by the soft glow of a single gas lamp, showed the hands frozen at precisely 11:57, a cruel reminder of a life interrupted. James? She whispered, her voice trembling slightly, the name a ghost on her lips. She'd grown accustomed to speaking to him in the quiet hours, sharing her day, her loneliness, her lingering grief. It was a habit born of desperation, a way to keep a semblance of connection to the man who had been her world. A sudden chill snaked through the room, raising gooseflesh on her arms despite the lingering warmth of the late spring evening. The gaslight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, momentarily transforming familiar objects into grotesque shapes. Margaret clutched the watch tighter, her knuckles bone-white. The silence deepened, pressing in on her, heavy and suffocating. Then, from the darkness behind her, a voice. Low, gravelly, and yet familiar. Margaret. It wasn't James's voice. Not exactly. But it held a resonance, a quality that sent a shiver of both fear and recognition down her spine. She whirled around, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The parlor was empty, the shadows receding as the gaslight steadied. Had she imagined it? Grief could play cruel tricks on the mind, she knew. The years since James's death had been a tapestry woven with threads of sorrow, regret, and the haunting melody of what-ifs. She rose, her legs unsteady, and moved towards the windows overlooking the street. The gas lamps cast pools of yellow light on the cobblestones, illuminating the empty street. There was no one there, only the wind, rustling the leaves of the newly budding trees, a sound that now seemed to carry a whisper of her name. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the pain. She was a woman of 42, her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with silver, the lines around her eyes etched deeper by years of worry and sleepless nights. She had been a nurse during the war, tending to the broken bodies and shattered spirits of soldiers in a field hospital near Amiens. It was there she had met James, a young captain with a poet's soul and eyes that held the weight of the world. Their love had been a fragile bloom in a desolate landscape, a testament to the human spirit's capacity for hope even in the face of unimaginable horrors. Their time together had been brief, intense, and ultimately, tragically short. He'd returned to the front, promising to come back to her. He had come back, but not in the way she had dreamed. He'd been carried back, broken and scarred, both physically and emotionally. The war had taken something from him, something vital, leaving behind a shell of the man she had fallen in love with. He'd lived for 2 more years, haunted by nightmares and plagued by the lingering effects of his injuries. Those 2 years had been a different kind of battle, a silent, internal struggle that she had witnessed with a helpless ache in her heart. His death, when it finally came, had been a release, a merciful end to his suffering. But for Margaret, it had been the beginning of a different kind of pain, a hollow emptiness that no amount of time seemed to fill. She turned back to the room, the watch still clutched in her hand. The silence remained, heavy and expectant. The voice, the whisper of her name, had it been real? Or was it simply another manifestation of her grief, a phantom born of loneliness and longing? A sudden rapping at the front door shattered the stillness. Margaret jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Who could be calling at this hour? She hesitated, fear warring with a flicker of something else. Curiosity? Hope. The rapping came again, more insistent this time. With trembling hands, she placed James's watch on the mantelpiece, its silent face a stark contrast to the ornate clock ticking steadily above it. She moved towards the door, her steps echoing in the silent hallway, each footfall a drumbeat against the rising tide of her apprehension. As she reached for the doorknob, a single, chilling thought echoed in her mind. What if the voice hadn't been a figment of her imagination? What if it had been a warning? Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past in Gramercy Park. Margaret's hand hovered over the cold brass of the doorknob, her breath catching in her throat. The rapping had ceased, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. She peered through the peephole, her eye adjusting to the dim light of the porch. A figure stood shrouded in shadow, tall and broad-shouldered, the brim of a fedora obscuring his face. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the faint scent of pipe tobacco, James's favorite blend, unexpectedly wafting through the crack beneath the door. It couldn't be. Could it? With trembling fingers, she undid the latch and slowly opened the door, the chain still securely fastened. The man stepped forward, the porch light catching the sharp planes of his face, revealing a stranger. He was older than James would have been, his face weathered and lined, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes that held a curious mixture of weariness and determination. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of silver hair that contrasted sharply with his dark eyebrows. "Mrs. Calloway?" he asked, his voice the same low rumble that had spoken her name in the parlor. It was a voice that resonated with a faint, almost imperceptible, accent she couldn't quite place. "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice barely a whisper, her mind reeling. "My name is Arthur Kensington. I believe I have something that belongs to you, or rather, belonged to your husband." He held out a small, worn leather pouch. Margaret hesitated, her gaze fixed on the pouch. It looked vaguely familiar, like something unearthed from a long-forgotten trunk. She cautiously unhooked the chain and opened the door wider, her senses on high alert. "I apologize for the late hour, Mrs. Calloway, but I assure you, this is a matter of some urgency," Kensington continued, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her uneasy. How did you know about my husband?" she asked, her voice gaining a little strength. "I served with Captain Calloway in France," Kensington replied, his gaze softening slightly. "We were close. He entrusted me with this pouch shortly before the incident at Argonne." The mention of Argonne sent a fresh wave of grief through Margaret. She reached for the pouch, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the chill that had gripped her earlier. She drew the pouch inside, her mind racing. What could James have entrusted to this stranger? And why had he waited so long to deliver it? "May I come in, Mrs. Calloway? I promise I won't take up much of your time." Kensington's voice was polite, but there was an underlying urgency that belied his calm demeanor. Margaret hesitated again. It was late, she was alone, and this man was a complete stranger. But something in his eyes, a flicker of genuine concern, perhaps, or maybe it was the lingering scent of James's tobacco, persuaded her. "Very well, Mr. Kensington. Please come in." She led him into the parlor, the same room where she had heard his voice just moments before. The gaslight cast long shadows on the walls, illuminating the familiar furniture, the worn rug, the framed photographs of James on the mantelpiece, his youthful smile a stark contrast to the haunted eyes she remembered from his final years. Kensington stood awkwardly for a moment, his gaze taking in the room, his eyes lingering on the photographs. He seemed to be searching for something, his expression unreadable. "Please sit down," Margaret said, gesturing towards the armchair opposite hers. He sat, placing his hat on the small table beside him. He leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze fixed on the leather pouch in Margaret's hands. "Captain Calloway spoke of you often, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice softening. "He cherished you deeply. He wanted to protect you, even from beyond the grave." Margaret's heart clenched. "Protect me? From what?" Kensington sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "The war, it changed things, Mrs. Calloway. It created alliances and betrayals, secrets and lies. Your husband, he became involved in something dangerous, something that could still have repercussions, even now." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Margaret felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She opened the pouch, her fingers fumbling with the drawstring. Inside, nestled amongst a few crumpled, yellowed letters, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was locked. "The key, Mrs. Calloway," Kensington said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is hidden within the watch." Margaret looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. She glanced at the mantelpiece, at the silent, silver watch that had been her constant companion for years. The watch that had suddenly, inexplicably, stopped ticking at midnight. She rose and retrieved it, her hands shaking. Could it be true? Could James have hidden something inside the watch, something so important that it had taken a stranger 4 years to bring it to her? She examined the watch closely, turning it over and over in her hands. It felt heavier than usual, the weight of its secret pressing down on her. As she ran her fingers along the engraved oak leaves and acorns, she felt a slight indentation, a tiny, almost imperceptible irregularity in the design. She pressed it, and with a soft click, a small compartment sprang open, revealing a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper and a small, tarnished key. The key to the box. And, perhaps, the key to unlocking the secrets of James's past and the reason for the stranger's visit on this unsettling night. Chapter 3. The Letter from Amiens. Margaret's fingers trembled as she carefully unfolded the tiny piece of paper hidden within the watch. The paper was thin and brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably James's. It was a letter, dated October 1918, just weeks before the armistice. The words swam before her eyes, blurring with the sudden rush of tears. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I am likely gone, and the war has claimed another victim. But know this, my love, my heart remains with you, always. The watch, my faithful companion, holds a secret, a burden I could not carry alone. I entrusted it to Arthur Kensington, a man I trust with my life, and now with yours. He will explain everything. There are things you do not know, Margaret, things I could not tell you for your own safety. I became entangled in a web of deceit, a game of shadows played by men who value power above all else. I discovered something that could expose them, something that could change the course of the future. It is hidden within the box. Guard it with your life, my love, for it is more precious than you can imagine. I long for the day we can be together again, free from the horrors of this war. But if that day never comes, know that I loved you more than words can say. You are the light in my darkness, the hope that kept me going. Live your life, Margaret. Be happy. And never forget me. Forever yours, James." The letter slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. Margaret sank back into her chair, her body trembling, her mind reeling. James's words, written from the heart of the war, echoed in the silence of the room, a testament to his love and a chilling warning of danger. He had been involved in something secret, something dangerous, something that had followed him even after death. Arthur Kensington watched her with a mixture of sympathy and concern. He picked up the letter and carefully folded it, placing it back in the watch compartment. "He was a brave man, Mrs. Calloway," he said softly.
"And a good man."
"He did what he thought was right, even when it put him at great risk." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. What was it, Mr. Kensington? What did he discover? Kensington hesitated, his gaze shifting to the wooden box in her lap. It's complicated, Mrs. Calloway. It involves a conspiracy. A plot to undermine the peace negotiations, to prolong the war for personal gain. Margaret gasped. But why? Who would do such a thing? Men with power and influence, Kensington replied grimly. Men who profit from war, men who crave control. They operate in the shadows, pulling strings, manipulating events. Your husband stumbled upon their plans, and he threatened to expose them. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The box contains evidence, Mrs. Calloway. Documents, names, dates, everything needed to bring them down. But it is also a target. They will stop at nothing to get it back. Margaret's blood ran cold. She looked at the box, no longer seeing a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, but a dangerous object, a Pandora's box filled with secrets that could cost her her life. What am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice trembling. You have two choices, Mrs. Calloway, Kensington replied. You can destroy the box and its contents, walk away, and try to forget this ever happened. Or you can fight. You can finish what your husband started. You can expose these men and bring them to justice. He paused, his eyes searching hers. It won't be easy. It will be dangerous. But you are not alone. I will help you. I made a promise to James, and I intend to keep it. Margaret looked at him, her mind racing. She had lived a quiet life since James's death, a life of solitude and grief. She had avoided the world, seeking refuge in the familiar comforts of her home. But now, she was faced with a choice that could shatter her peaceful existence and plunge her into a world of intrigue and danger. Could she do it? Could she face the risks, the threats, the unknown? Could she honor James's memory by fighting for justice, even if it meant putting her own life on the line? She looked at the box again, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. Inside lay the truth, the key to unraveling a conspiracy that had cost her husband his life. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She had to fight. For James. For herself. And for the future. She looked up at Kensington, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. Tell me everything, she said, her voice firm, her resolve unwavering. The quiet life she had known was over. A new battle had begun. And this time, she would not be a bystander. Chapter 4. A stranger at the doorstep. Kensington leaned back, a faint smile playing on his lips. Very well, Mrs. Calloway. Let's begin. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, silver flask. Perhaps a bit of fortification is in order? He offered, unscrewing the cap. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She needed something to steady her nerves, to calm the storm raging within her. Kensington poured a generous amount of amber liquid into 2 small glasses he found on a nearby sideboard. The scent of aged whiskey filled the air, a familiar aroma that brought back a fleeting memory of James, sharing a stolen drink with him in the dimly lit officer's tent near Amiens. They drank in silence, the whiskey burning a warm trail down her throat, settling her nerves somewhat. Kensington then began to explain, his voice low and measured, painting a picture of a world far removed from the quiet gentility of Gramercy Park. He spoke of a clandestine organization known only as the Circle, a group of powerful men from various countries, all with vested interests in prolonging the war. They were industrialists, financiers, politicians, and even some military leaders, all united by their greed and their thirst for power. They manipulated supply lines, sabotaged peace talks, and even instigated battles to keep the war machine churning, Kensington explained, his voice laced with disgust. They profited immensely from the bloodshed, while millions died in the trenches. James, he revealed, had been working as an intelligence officer tasked with uncovering leaks within the Allied command. He had stumbled upon evidence of the Circle's activities quite by accident, a coded message intercepted from a German agent. He was a brilliant cryptographer, your husband, Kensington said, a hint of admiration in his voice. He cracked the code, revealing the names of several key members of the Circle and their plans to sabotage the upcoming peace negotiations in Versailles. James had gathered further evidence, meticulously documenting the Circle's activities, compiling a dossier that would expose their treachery. He had planned to present his findings to his superiors, but he had been betrayed. Someone within his own unit had tipped off the Circle, leading to the ambush at Argonne. They tried to kill him, Mrs. Calloway, Kensington said, his voice hardening. They wanted to silence him, to bury the truth. But he survived, long enough to entrust me with the box and its contents. Margaret listened in stunned silence, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was hearing. Her husband, the gentle, poetry-loving man she had known, had been a key player in a dangerous game of international espionage. He had risked his life to expose a conspiracy that threatened to undermine the fragile peace, and he had paid the ultimate price. "But why did you wait so long to come to me?" Margaret asked, her voice laced with a hint of suspicion. Kensington sighed. "I was being watched, Mrs. Calloway. Closely. The Circle has eyes and ears everywhere. I had to be careful to make sure it was safe to contact you. I had to find a way to get the box to you without putting you in immediate danger." He explained that he had been working undercover, gathering further evidence, trying to identify the remaining members of the Circle who were still at large. He had used his contacts within the intelligence community to track their movements, to uncover their plans. "They are still active, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice grim. "They are still trying to influence events, to shape the world to their liking. And they know about the box. They know that it contains evidence that could destroy them. They'll be looking for it. And they will be looking for you." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. She looked at the wooden box, now resting on the table beside her, a silent testament to the danger that had just walked into her life. She was no longer just a grieving widow, she was a target. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kensington met her gaze, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "We fight back, Mrs. Calloway. We use the evidence in the box to expose them, to bring them to justice. We finish what your husband started." He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "But first, we need to get you to a safe place. Somewhere they won't find you. Somewhere we can plan our next move." He looked around the parlor, his eyes assessing the room, the windows, the doors. "This house, it's too exposed. They could be watching us right now." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. The familiar comfort of her home had been shattered, replaced by a sense of impending danger. She looked at Kensington, her eyes pleading. Where can we go?" He smiled, a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I have a place in mind, Mrs. Calloway. A place where we can be safe. For now." He extended his hand to her. "Come. We must leave quickly, before it's too late." A sudden loud bang from upstairs made them both jump. The sound of shattering glass echoed down the stairwell, mixing with the increasingly loud pounding from the front door, as though an army had come to collect what the box held. Chapter 5. Whispers of Espionage and Betrayal. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Kensington grabbed the wooden box from the table and shoved it into his coat pocket. "Go. Out the back. Through the garden," he ordered, his voice sharp and urgent. They scrambled through the kitchen, the sounds of the front door splintering under duress echoing behind them. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of chaos. She fumbled with the lock on the back door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp the knob. Kensington pushed past her, his own hand steady and sure, and threw the door open. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and blooming roses. The small, walled garden, usually a haven of peace and tranquility, now seemed menacing, the shadows of the surrounding buildings stretching long and distorted in the moonlight. "This way," Kensington hissed, pulling her along a narrow path that led to a small gate at the back of the garden. The gate opened onto a narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. They ran, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Margaret could hear shouts, male voices, harsh and guttural, speaking in a language she didn't understand. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Kensington's strong grip kept her upright. They reached the end of the alleyway and emerged onto a quiet side street. Kensington pulled her into the shadows of a building, pressing her against the cold brick wall. He peered around the corner, his body tense, his eyes scanning the street. "They're still behind us," he whispered, his breath ragged. "We need to get off the streets. They'll be searching for us." Margaret leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath, her mind racing. She had never experienced anything like this before. The fear was a palpable thing, a cold knot in her stomach, a suffocating pressure in her chest. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To a safe house," Kensington replied. "Not far from here. But we need to be careful. We can't risk being seen." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows, avoiding the main streets, sticking to the back alleys and narrow passageways. The city, usually so familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and dangerous, a labyrinth of hidden threats. As they walked, Kensington explained more about the safe house. It was a small, unassuming apartment above a bakery, owned by a woman named Mrs. O'Malley, a widow who had been a contact of his during the war. "She's trustworthy," he assured Margaret. "She helped many Allied agents escape during the war. She'll keep us hidden." They reached the bakery, its windows dark and shuttered. Kensington led Margaret to a side door, hidden in a narrow alcove. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with a kind, wrinkled face and sharp, intelligent eyes. "Arthur?" Mrs. O'Malley whispered, her voice raspy with age. "What's happened? And who is this?" "This is Mrs. Calloway, Maggie," Kensington replied. "She's in danger. We need your help." Mrs. O'Malley's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't hesitate. "Come in, quickly," she said, ushering them inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and warm. The scent of freshly baked bread hung in the air, a comforting aroma that momentarily eased Margaret's anxiety. Mrs. O'Malley led them to a small sitting room, lit by a single oil lamp. She gestured for them to sit on a worn sofa, while she busied herself making tea. "Now, tell me everything," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. Kensington quickly explained the situation, omitting no details. He revealed everything, the names of the powerful, faceless men, and James' efforts. Margaret listened, her heart aching, the reality of her situation sinking in. She wasn't just grieving, she was a pawn in a deadly game. Mrs. O'Malley listened intently, her expression grave. When Kensington had finished, she nodded slowly. "I see," she said. "The Circle. I've heard whispers of them. They're a dangerous lot." She poured tea into 3 chipped cups, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. "You can stay here as long as you need to," she said, handing Margaret a cup. "They won't find you here. I know how to keep a secret." Margaret took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through her chilled body. She looked at Mrs. O'Malley, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You're risking a lot for us." Mrs. O'Malley smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. "It's nothing, child," she said. "I've seen too much suffering in my life. I'll do whatever I can to help." Kensington leaned forward, his expression serious. "We need to figure out our next move, Maggie," he said. "We need to decide how to use the evidence in the box. We need to find a way to expose the Circle without getting ourselves killed." He pulled the wooden box from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. The 3 of them stared at it, the silence in the room broken only by the gentle ticking of a clock on the wall. The box, with its intricate carvings and hidden secrets, held the key to their future, a future that was now uncertain and fraught with danger. A scraping sound from the window facing the street outside caused everyone to grow quiet then. All that could be heard was the muffled curse of a drunken man from the street below. Chapter 6. The Hidden Compartment in the Watch. The near-miss scare from the street below had left them all on edge. Mrs. O'Malley, ever practical, drew heavy curtains across the window, plunging the room into a deeper, safer gloom, illuminated only by the flickering oil lamp. The aroma of the cooling tea mingled with the ever-present scent of baking bread, a strange juxtaposition of the mundane and the perilous. Kensington cleared his throat, drawing Margaret's attention back to the box. "We should examine the contents, Mrs. Calloway. See exactly what your husband managed to gather." Margaret nodded, her hands still trembling slightly. She reached for the box, the polished wood cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She inserted the tiny key, retrieved from James's watch, into the lock. It turned with a soft click. A collective breath was held as she slowly lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were several neatly folded documents, a small, leather-bound notebook, and a photograph. Margaret carefully lifted out the first document. It was a letter, written in French, addressed to a man named Henri Dubois, a prominent industrialist known for his dealings in munitions. The letter detailed a shipment of weapons, ostensibly destined for the Allied forces, but with instructions to divert a portion to a neutral country, where they would be sold to the enemy. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The letter was signed with a single initial. R. "Who is R?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kensington leaned closer, examining the letter. "It could be several people," he said. "But my guess is it's either Baron Rothschild, a known financier with ties to both sides of the conflict, or someone in the Rothschild family's very close circle. He's the most likely member with the most influence." He picked up the next document. It was a list of names, some familiar, some unknown, all connected to various industries that profited from the war. Each name was followed by a series of numbers, codes that Margaret couldn't decipher. "This is a ledger," Kensington explained. "A record of payments, bribes, and transactions. It's all coded, but your husband likely has the key to decipher it somewhere in his notes." He picked up the leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn and faded, the pages filled with James's neat, meticulous handwriting. It was a journal, a detailed account of his investigation, his discoveries, his suspicions, and his fears. Margaret began to read, her eyes scanning the pages, her heart aching with each entry. She read about James's initial doubts, his growing suspicion, his gradual unraveling of the conspiracy. She read about his encounters with informants, his secret meetings, his close calls. She read about his love for her, his longing for their reunion, his fear that he might not survive. And then she found it, a page marked with a series of symbols, a key to the coded ledger. James had written, the watch, the time, the date. The answer lies within. Margaret looked up, her eyes widening. "The watch," she exclaimed. "He's talking about his watch again." Kensington's eyes lit up. Of course. The time had stopped. 11:57. And the date. The date he was injured. October 26, 1918. He quickly cross-referenced the numbers with a coded ledger, using the date and time as a key. The numbers began to make sense, revealing the names of companies, bank accounts, and individuals involved in the circle's illicit activities. The final item in the box was the photograph. Margaret picked it up, her heart pounding. It was a picture of a group of men, standing in front of a grand building, somewhere in Europe. She recognized some of the faces from the ledger, men of power and influence, smiling for the camera, unaware that their treachery was about to be exposed. And then she saw him. Standing at the edge of the group, slightly out of focus, was a man she recognized instantly. Sergeant Alistair Finch, James's closest friend, and the man who had been with him at Argonne. The man who had carried James, wounded, back. The betrayal felt like another physical hit. "Finch," she whispered, her voice trembling. It was Finch who betrayed him. Kensington stared at the photograph, his face grim. "It seems so," he said. "He must have been working for the Circle all along. He was the one who tipped them off, who led them to James." Margaret felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Finch, the man she had trusted, the man who had comforted her after James's death, had been his murderer, in a manner of speaking. The pain of betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a picture of treachery and deceit that was far more complex and far-reaching than she could have ever imagined. Her husband had been a hero, a man who had risked everything to expose the truth. And now, she was carrying on his legacy, holding the evidence that could bring down a powerful and dangerous organization. But the photograph also presented a new challenge. Finch was still alive.
He was still out there somewhere.
And he would know about the box. He would be looking for it.
And he would be looking for her.
The weight of the situation pressed down on her, the danger closing in. But amidst the fear, a flicker of determination ignited within her. She would not let James's sacrifice be in vain. She would expose the circle, and she would bring Finch to justice. Even if it was the last thing she did. Outside the apartment, the sounds of the city drifted in, a constant reminder of the world beyond their hiding place. A sudden, sharp rap at the door sent a fresh jolt of fear, quickly followed by Mrs. O'Malley's soft voice, calling out that it was only her neighbor with fresh milk. Chapter 7. Decoding the cipher in the dark. The momentary relief brought by Mrs. O'Malley's explanation about the knock was quickly replaced by the renewed tension of their task. The wooden box, now emptied of its larger contents, still held the weight of its secrets that needed to be fully understood before they could be acted upon. "We need to decipher the rest of these codes," Kensington said, his voice low and focused, gesturing towards the ledger and James's journal. "There may be more names, more details, more evidence that we can use." Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of numbers and symbols. James's code, based on the watch's stop time and the date of his injury, had unlocked a significant portion, but there were still pages of encrypted information remaining. "He was always fascinated by codes and ciphers," Margaret said, a faint smile touching her lips as she remembered James's playful challenges, creating secret messages for her to decipher during their courtship. He used to say it was like unraveling a mystery, revealing the hidden truth beneath the surface. Mrs. O'Malley, ever resourceful, produced a small, battered tin box from a cupboard. "I have some things here that might be useful," she said, opening the box to reveal a collection of magnifying glasses, rulers, and various other tools. "Leftovers from my husband's work. He was a clockmaker, you see." Margaret's eyes widened. "A clockmaker?" she repeated, a sudden thought striking her. Perhaps there's more to James's watch than we realized." She picked up the watch again, examining it closely under the magnifying glass. She ran her fingers along the engraved surface, feeling for any irregularities, any hidden compartments. She pressed the small indentation that had revealed the key and the first letter, but nothing else happened. "There must be something else," she murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. He wouldn't have left the entire code exposed. Kensington watched her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Take your time, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "We have all night." Hours passed, the only sounds in the room the gentle ticking of Mrs. O'Malley's clock, the scratching of Kensington's pen as he worked on deciphering the ledger, and the occasional sigh of frustration from Margaret. She examined every inch of the watch, every detail of the engraving, every crevice and seam. She tried various combinations of numbers, dates, and times, but nothing seemed to work. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. Margaret's eyes were burning, her head was aching, and her fingers were cramped. She was about to give up, to admit defeat, when she noticed something she had overlooked before. On the back of the watch, beneath the inscription of James's name and regiment, there was a tiny, almost imperceptible line, a hairline crack in the metal. It was so small that it was barely visible to the naked eye, but under the magnifying glass, it was clear. She carefully inserted the tip of a small, sharp tool from Mrs. O'Malley's box into the crack and gently pried it open. With a soft click, a second compartment sprang open, revealing another tiny, folded piece of paper. Margaret's heart leaped with excitement. She carefully unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. It was another key, a more complex code, based on a series of letters and numbers, arranged in a grid. "I think I've found it," she exclaimed, her voice filled with renewed energy. Kensington looked up, his eyes widening. Are you sure? Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the grid. It's a Playfair cipher, she said.
James used to talk about it.
It's a substitution cipher that uses a keyword to encrypt the message. She looked at the grid again, her eyes searching for a clue. And then she saw it. In the top left corner of the grid, written in tiny letters, was a single word, Amiens.
Amiens.
The city where they had met, where they had fallen in love, where their lives had changed forever. It was the perfect keyword, a secret known only to them. Using the Amiens keyword, Margaret and Kensington began to decipher the remaining codes in the ledger. The names of more individuals, more companies, more transactions came to light, revealing the full extent of the Circle's network and their insidious activities. They discovered evidence of arms dealing, political manipulation, and even assassinations, all orchestrated by the Circle to prolong the war and maintain their power. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering, far greater than they had initially imagined. As the dawn approached, casting a faint glow through the drawn curtains, they finally finished their task. The ledger was completely deciphered, the secrets of the Circle laid bare. They had the evidence they needed to expose them, to bring them to justice. But they also knew that they were running out of time. Finch was still out there, and he would be looking for them. They needed to act quickly, before he found them. Margaret looked at Kensington, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. What do we do now? She asked. Kensington met her gaze, his expression resolute. We go to the authorities, he said. We present the evidence to someone we can trust. Someone who can help us bring the Circle down. But who could they trust? In a world of spies and betrayals, where even the closest of friends could turn out to be enemies, finding someone to believe them, someone with the power and influence to act, would be their greatest challenge yet. A challenge that would decide the fate of not only themselves, but potentially the fragile fabric of newly established world. Chapter 8. Memories of a Wartime Wedding. The decision to go to the authorities was made, but the question of who to trust loomed large. Kensington paced the small confines of Mrs. O'Malley's apartment, his brow furrowed in thought. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself drawn back to James's journal. She needed to feel close to him, to find strength in his words, in his memory. She turned to the pages detailing their brief courtship in Amiens, a period of stolen moments amidst the chaos and carnage of war. She reread his descriptions of their first meeting at the field hospital, her hands covered in blood, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and admiration. She smiled at his recounting of their awkward first conversations, their shared love of poetry, their stolen kisses under the pale moonlight. And then she reached the entry describing their wedding. A simple ceremony, performed by a chaplain in a bombed-out church, their witnesses a handful of fellow nurses and soldiers, their wedding rings fashioned from spent shell casings. August 14th, 1918 today, I married the most extraordinary woman in the world. Margaret, my angel of mercy, my light in the darkness. We exchanged vows amidst the ruins of a church, a symbol of hope amidst destruction. The shelling was distant but persistent, a soundtrack to the most important event in my life. I will probably forget that. Sergeant Finch was my best man, his steady presence a comfort in the midst of the chaos. He's like a brother. I feel so much relief knowing he is here with me. He joked about owing me a proper wedding gift, when all this is over. I laughed. What's the point of waiting for a gift when I have my bride? Margaret wore a simple white dress, borrowed from one of the nurses, a sprig of wildflowers tucked into her hair. She was radiant, her beauty shining through the grime and exhaustion of war. I promised her a lifetime of happiness, a future free from fear and sorrow. I pray I can keep that promise. Margaret closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. The memory of their wedding, so vivid in her mind, was a bittersweet reminder of what she had lost. The simple ceremony, the makeshift rings, the borrowed dress that had been perfect, a testament to their love, a beacon of hope in a world consumed by darkness. And Finch, he had been there, too, standing beside James, his supposed friend, his betrayer. The thought of his duplicity made her sick to her stomach. Kensington, who had been silently watching her, came and sat beside her. He gently took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I know it's difficult, Margaret," he said softly, "but we can't let grief consume us. We need to focus on the task at hand." Margaret nodded, wiping away her tears.
"You're right," she said.
"We need to find someone we can trust." "I've been thinking," Kensington said, his voice thoughtful. "There's one person who might be able to help us. Senator Alastair Davies. He's a powerful man with a reputation for integrity. He's also on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's been a vocal critic of the war profiteering." Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with a flicker of hope. "Do you think he'll believe us?" "He's a shrewd man," Kensington replied. "He won't take our word for it. But if we present him with the evidence, with the ledger, the letters, the photograph, I think he'll listen." "But how do we get to him?" Margaret asked. "He's in Washington. And Finch, he could be anywhere. He could be watching us." "We'll need to be careful," Kensington said. "We'll need to travel under the radar, avoid detection. We'll need a plan." Mrs. O'Malley, who had been quietly listening to their conversation, spoke up. "I have an idea," she said, her voice firm. "My nephew, Sean, he works on the railroad. He's a conductor on the overnight train to Washington. He's a good lad, trustworthy. I could ask him to help you." Margaret and Kensington exchanged a look. It was a risky proposition, trusting a stranger with their lives, but they were running out of options. "Do you think he would do it?" Margaret asked. Mrs. O'Malley nodded.
"He would.
"He owes me a favor, and he hates injustice as much as I do." "Then it's settled," Kensington said. "We'll take the train to Washington. We'll contact Senator Davies and present him with the evidence. And we'll pray that he can help us bring the circle down." The plan was set. They would leave that night, under the cover of darkness, embarking on a perilous journey to Washington, carrying with them the secrets that could change the world. As Margaret prepared to leave, she took one last look around Mrs. O'Malley's apartment, a haven that has sheltered them. As she turned to leave, a newsboy outside was yelling, "Extra! Extra!"
Read all about it.
Which only served to remind them that time was running out. Chapter 9. The Unsent Letter and a Hidden Promise. Before leaving Mrs. O'Malley's sanctuary, Margaret felt a compelling need to re-examine James's belongings, the few items she had kept with her since his death. They were stored in a small, worn trunk in the corner of the room, a tangible link to the past she couldn't quite let go of. Kensington and Mrs. O'Malley were discussing the logistics of their journey with Sean, the nephew, leaving Margaret to her private moment of remembrance. She knelt beside the trunk, the scent of old leather and mothballs rising to greet her. Inside, nestled amongst his folded uniform and a few cherished books, was a small packet of letters, their correspondence during the war. She carefully untied the ribbon that held them together, her fingers tracing the familiar loops and swirls of James's handwriting on each envelope. She had read these letters countless times, finding solace in his words, in his unwavering love. But tonight, she was searching for something more, something she had missed before, a clue, a hint, anything that might help her understand the full extent of his secret life. She sorted through the letters, chronologically, reliving their brief, intense romance through his words. She reached the last letter he had sent her, the one she had received just days before his injury at Argonne. It was filled with his usual expressions of love, his hopes for the future, his longing for their reunion. But as she unfolded the letter, she noticed something unusual, a small, almost imperceptible bulge in the paper. She carefully examined the envelope, running her fingers along the seams. And then she found it, a hidden pocket, cleverly concealed within the lining of the envelope. Her heart pounded with anticipation. She carefully tore open the lining, revealing another, smaller letter, folded tightly and sealed with wax. It was addressed to her, but in a different handwriting, more formal, more deliberate. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. It was from James, but it was unlike any letter he had ever written to her before. It was a confession, a revelation, a desperate plea for understanding. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means that I have failed and that the worst has come to pass. I have kept a secret from you, a burden I could not share, for fear of endangering your life. I am involved in something far more dangerous than you can imagine, something that could cost me everything. I have discovered a conspiracy, a plot to undermine the peace, to prolong the war for personal gain. I have gathered evidence, proof of their treachery. But I am being watched, hunted. I fear I may not survive. I have entrusted a key piece of evidence to Arthur Kensington, a man I trust implicitly. He will seek you out. He will explain everything. Trust him, Margaret. He will protect you. But there is one more thing, a secret I have kept even from Arthur. It is a promise, a vow I made to a dying man. A promise that could expose the true mastermind behind the circle, the one pulling the strings from the shadows. On the eve of the battle at Amiens, I met a German officer, a prisoner of war, a man named Klaus Richter. He was a good man caught on the wrong side of the conflict. He knew about the circle. He had been their unwilling pawn. He gave me a name, a code name, Phoenix. He said Phoenix was the leader, the architect of the conspiracy. He said Phoenix was a man of immense power and influence, a man who could control the fate of nations. Richter made me promise to expose Phoenix, to bring him to justice. He said it was the only way to end the cycle of violence, to ensure a lasting peace. He died in my arms, his last words a plea for vengeance. I have kept this promise secret, fearing the consequences. But now I have no choice. If I am gone, you must find Phoenix, Margaret. You must expose him. He is the key to everything. I love you, Margaret. Always and forever.
James.
The letter slipped from Margaret's numb fingers. The revelation was staggering. Phoenix. A code name for the true mastermind behind the circle. A man even more powerful, more dangerous than the names they had already uncovered. Kensington and Mrs. O'Malley, alerted by her gasp, rushed to her side. She handed Kensington the letter, her eyes filled with tears and a newfound fear. He read the letter quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each line. Phoenix, he murmured, his voice filled with disbelief. I've heard whispers of that name, but I never believed. Who is he, Arthur? Margaret asked, her voice trembling. Who is Phoenix? Kensington shook his head.
I don't know, he said.
But I know this. We are dealing with something far bigger, far more dangerous than we ever imagined. We are not just fighting a conspiracy. We are fighting a ghost. The unsent letter had changed everything. It had revealed a new layer of the conspiracy, a hidden enemy, a mastermind lurking in the shadows. It had also given them a new mission, a new purpose, to find Phoenix, to expose him, to fulfill James's dying wish. But time was running out. Finch was still out there, and now they had another, even more formidable enemy to contend with. As they prepared to embark on their perilous journey to Washington, they knew that they were walking into a trap, a web of deceit and danger from which they might never escape. The weight of their secrets, and their increasing number, was heavy on them as they walked toward the train. Chapter 10. The Shadow of Sergeant Alastair Finch. The train rattled through the darkness, a steel serpent winding its way south towards Washington. Margaret and Kensington sat huddled in a dimly lit compartment, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks a constant reminder of their journey, their mission, and the danger that pursued them. Sean, Mrs. O'Malley's nephew, had secured them a private compartment, a small space with worn velvet seats and a single, flickering gas lamp. He had promised to keep their presence a secret, to alert them to any suspicious activity. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, but his eyes held a quiet determination, a willingness to help that Margaret found both reassuring and unsettling. Kensington had spent the past few hours studying the documents from the box, poring over the ledger, the letters, and James's journal, searching for any clue, any hint that might lead them to Phoenix. He had made some progress, identifying a few more names, uncovering a few more connections, but the identity of the mastermind remained elusive. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself haunted by the image of Sergeant Alastair Finch. His betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, a constant ache in her heart. She had trusted him, she had considered him a friend, and he had repaid her kindness with treachery. She pulled out the photograph from the box, the one showing Finch standing amongst the members of the circle. She studied his face, searching for any sign of the man she had known, the man who had comforted her after James's death. But all she saw was a stranger, a cold, calculating man who had played a role in her husband's demise. "He's still out there, Arthur," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He knows about the box. He'll be looking for us." Kensington nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said. "We need to be prepared. He's a dangerous man, Margaret. He won't hesitate to kill us." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, silver pistol. He checked the chamber, making sure it was loaded, then handed it to Margaret. "Can you use one of these?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. She had seen guns during the war. She had even helped to clean and sterilize them in the field hospital. But she had never fired one, never even held one in her hands. I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to learn," Kensington said, his voice firm. "We can't rely on luck alone. We need to be able to defend ourselves." He showed her how to hold the gun, how to aim, how to pull the trigger. He explained the safety mechanisms, the recoil, the potential for danger. Margaret listened intently, her hands shaking as she held the cold metal in her grasp. The idea of using a gun, of taking a life, was abhorrent to her. But she knew that she might have no choice. She was fighting for her life, for James's memory, for the future. She had to be prepared to do whatever it took to survive. They practiced in silence, Kensington guiding her movements, correcting her stance, offering words of encouragement. Margaret gradually grew more comfortable with the gun, her hands becoming steadier, her aim more accurate. But the weight of the responsibility, the potential for violence, weighed heavily on her. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to set in. The rhythmic clatter of the train, the flickering light, the constant tension, had taken their toll. Margaret leaned her head against the window, her eyes closing. She drifted in and out of sleep, her dreams filled with images of James, of Finch, of the war, of the box and its contents. She saw James's face, smiling, beckoning her to join him. She saw Finch's face, sneering, threatening her. She saw the horrors of the war, the blood, the bodies, the endless suffering. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body covered in a cold sweat. She looked around the compartment, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Kensington was asleep, slumped in his seat, his head resting on his chest. She felt a sudden urge to get out of the compartment, to breathe fresh air, to escape the claustrophobic confines of the train. She carefully stood up, trying not to wake Kensington, and quietly opened the door. She stepped out into the corridor, the air cooler, fresher than in the compartment. She walked slowly towards the end of the carriage, towards the observation platform, hoping to catch a glimpse of the passing landscape. As she reached the platform, she saw a figure standing there, silhouetted against the faint glow of the dawn. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his back to her. Her heart leaped into her throat. She recognized the stance, the silhouette, the way he held himself. It was Finch. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the pistol in her pocket. She was about to call out his name, to confront him, when she heard a voice behind her. "Looking for someone, Mrs. Calloway?" She whirled around, her heart pounding, and found a different man blocking the exit back inside. It wasn't Kensington. Chapter 11. A rendezvous at the Grand Central Terminal. Margaret's hand tightened around the pistol in her pocket, her mind racing. The man blocking the exit was a stranger, short and stocky, with a cruel, pockmarked face and cold, calculating eyes. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hands hidden in his pockets, a clear sign of menace. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. The man smiled, a chilling, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'm a friend of Sergeant Finch," he replied, his voice raspy and menacing. "He sent me to collect something that belongs to him. Something your husband stole." Margaret's blood ran cold. Finch had found them. He had sent this man to retrieve the box, to silence her. She knew she had to act quickly before he alerted the man on the platform, before she was trapped between them. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to sound innocent, stalling for time. The man's smile widened. "Don't play coy with me, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "We know about the box. We know about the documents. We know about everything." He took a step closer, his hand reaching into his pocket. Margaret knew he was reaching for a weapon, a gun or a knife, something to subdue her, to kill her. She had no choice. She pulled out the pistol, her hand shaking, and pointed it at him.
"Stay back,"
she ordered, her voice surprisingly firm. The man stopped, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected her to be armed, to be prepared to fight. He hesitated, his hand still in his pocket, assessing the situation. "You don't want to do this, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice losing some of its menace. "You're outmatched. You're outnumbered. Just give me the box and no one gets hurt." "I'm not afraid of you," Margaret replied, her voice steadier now, her resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid of Finch. I'm not afraid of anyone." She took a step closer, her finger tightening on the trigger. She knew she might have to shoot him, to take his life to save her own. She had never killed anyone before, but she was prepared to do whatever it took to protect herself, to protect James's legacy. Suddenly, a voice from behind her, from the observation platform, broke the tense silence. "Drop the gun, Mrs. Calloway." It was Finch. His voice was cold, commanding, devoid of any emotion. He had turned around, his own gun drawn, pointed directly at her. Margaret was trapped. She was surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She was about to lose everything. But then a miracle happened. A sudden lurch of the train, a sharp screech of brakes, threw everyone off balance. The man in front of Margaret stumbled forward, his hand flying out of his pocket, revealing a small, gleaming knife. Margaret, caught off guard, squeezed the trigger. The pistol fired, the sound deafening in the confined space. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder, the knife clattering to the floor. He stumbled backward, crashing against the door, his face contorted in pain. The train came to a sudden, jarring halt, throwing everyone to the floor. Margaret fell, her head hitting the ground with a sickening thud. She blacked out. When she came to, she was lying on the floor of the corridor, her head throbbing, her body aching. She looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had happened. The compartment door was open. Kensington was kneeling beside her, his face filled with concern. "Margaret, are you all right?" he asked, his voice urgent. She nodded weakly, her head spinning. What happened?" "The train stopped," Kensington replied. "An emergency stop. I don't know why, but it saved us." He helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her. She looked around the corridor. The man with the knife was gone.
Finch was gone, too.
"They escaped," she said, her voice filled with disappointment. "They won't get far," Kensington said, his voice grim. "We're in Grand Central Terminal. The police will be here soon." He was right. They had arrived in Washington earlier than expected, under chaotic circumstances. The emergency stop, whatever its cause, had given them a reprieve, a chance to escape. But they were still in danger. Finch was still out there, and now, he knew they were in Washington. He would be looking for them, more determined than ever to retrieve the box. They had to get to Senator Davies to present him with the evidence, before Finch found them. They had to expose the circle before it was too late. Their arrival at the terminal, usually grand, was marked by utter disorder, with a palpable sense of panic and chaos. Chapter 12. The Truth Buried in Flanders Fields. Grand Central Terminal was a maelstrom of confusion. Passengers spilled out of the train, shouting questions, their faces a mixture of fear and bewilderment. Police officers swarmed the platforms, trying to restore order, their voices amplified by the cavernous architecture of the station. Kensington guided Margaret through the chaos, his hand firmly gripping her arm, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for any sign of Finch or his accomplice. They needed to get out of the station, to disappear into the anonymity of the city, before they were recognized. "We need to find a phone," Kensington said, his voice urgent. "We need to contact Senator Davies. Let him know we're here." They found a public telephone booth tucked away in a quiet corner of the station. Kensington dialed the number he had memorized, his hand trembling slightly. He waited, his ear pressed to the receiver, his eyes darting nervously around the station. "Senator Davies' office." A crisp, professional voice answered. "This is Arthur Kensington," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need to speak to the senator immediately. It's a matter of national security." There was a pause, a moment of hesitation. "The senator is a very busy man, Mr. Kensington," the voice replied. "I'm not sure he can be disturbed." "Tell him it's about the circle," Kensington said, his voice hardening. "Tell him it's about Phoenix. Tell him it's about James Calloway." The mention of those names seemed to have the desired effect. There was another pause, longer this time, then the voice returned, more accommodating. "Please hold, Mr. Kensington. I'll see if the senator can take your call." Kensington waited, his heart pounding, his grip tightening on the receiver. Margaret stood beside him, her own anxiety growing with each passing second. Finally, a new voice came on the line, a deep, authoritative voice that Margaret recognized from newsreels. "This is Senator Davies," the voice said. "Who is this, and what is this about?" Kensington quickly explained the situation, omitting no details. He told the senator about the box, the documents, the evidence of the circle's conspiracy. He told him about James Calloway, about Finch's betrayal, about their perilous journey to Washington. Senator Davies listened intently, his silence broken only by occasional questions, probing for details, clarifying facts. When Kensington had finished, the senator spoke, his voice grave. "This is a serious matter, Mr. Kensington," he said. "If what you say is true, we are dealing with a threat of immense proportions." "It is true, Senator," Kensington replied. "I have the evidence to prove it." "I need to see that evidence, Mr. Kensington," the senator said. "I need to see it immediately. Can you come to my office?" "We're at Grand Central Terminal," Kensington replied. "But we're being hunted, Senator. We need protection." "I understand," the senator said. "I'll send someone to meet you. Someone I trust. He'll be wearing a red carnation in his lapel. Wait for him at the information booth. And be careful, Mr. Kensington. Be very careful." The line went dead. Kensington hung up the phone, his face a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had reached Senator Davies, they had a chance to present their evidence, but they were still in danger. They made their way to the information booth, a large, ornate structure in the center of the main concourse. They waited, their eyes scanning the crowd, searching for a man wearing a red carnation. Minutes passed, stretching into an eternity. Every passing face, every approaching figure, sent a jolt of fear through Margaret's heart. She clutched the pistol in her pocket, her hand sweaty, her finger on the trigger. Suddenly she saw him, a tall, distinguished-looking man, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, wearing a dark suit and a red carnation in his lapel. He was walking towards them, his gaze sweeping the crowd, his expression serious. It was Senator Davies himself. Margaret and Kensington exchanged a look. They had expected an aide, a bodyguard, not the senator himself. His presence here, in this public place, was a risk, a sign of the gravity of the situation. They approached him, their steps hesitant, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Senator Davies?" Kensington asked, his voice low. The senator nodded, his gaze fixed on them. "Mr. Kensington? Mrs. Calloway?" They nodded in unison. "We need to talk," the senator said, his voice urgent. "But not here. Follow me." He turned and walked away, his pace brisk, his demeanor purposeful. Margaret and Kensington followed, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. As they walked, Senator Davies explained that he had been investigating the circle for months, suspecting their involvement in various political scandals and financial manipulations. But he had lacked concrete evidence, proof of their treachery. "Your husband's information could be the key, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and sorrow. "It could be what we need to finally bring them down." He led them to a private waiting room, hidden away from the hustle and bustle of the main concourse. He locked the door behind them, ensuring their privacy and their safety. They sat down, Margaret, Kensington, and Senator Davies, facing each other across a small table. Kensington placed the wooden box on the table, the centerpiece of their desperate mission. "The truth is in there, Senator," he said. "The truth about the circle. The truth about Phoenix. The truth about James Calloway's death." Senator Davies looked at the box, his eyes filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He knew that opening that box would change everything, that it would unleash a storm of consequences, that it could cost them their lives. But he also knew that he had no choice. He had to open it. He had to face the truth. He had to fight for justice. He reached for the box, his hand trembling slightly. He took a deep breath and opened the lid. What was contained within was a name, a carefully hidden, shocking name that will now be revealed to only these three. Chapter 13. A Stolen Kiss in a Moonlit Garden. The revelation of the name inside the box, Senator Alastair Davies himself, hung in the air, a suffocating silence punctuated only by the distant sounds of the terminal. Margaret stared at the senator, her mind reeling, unable to comprehend the implications of what she had just heard. Kensington, equally stunned, sat frozen in his chair, his eyes locked on the man he had trusted, the man he had believed would be their savior. Davies, his face pale, his hands trembling, closed the box slowly. He looked at Margaret, then at Kensington, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame, regret, and a chilling, calculated calm. "I suppose you're wondering why," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the authoritative tone he had used just moments before. Margaret couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, her heart pounding, her mind racing, trying to make sense of this impossible betrayal. Kensington found his voice, his words laced with anger and disbelief. "You're Phoenix?" he stammered. "You're the one who orchestrated all of this?" Davies nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table, to the box that contained his own damnation. "It started innocently enough," he said, his voice gaining a little strength, his words taking on a defensive tone. "A group of us, businessmen, politicians, military leaders, we believed we could guide the war, shape the outcome, ensure a favorable peace." He looked up, his eyes meeting Kensington's, a flicker of defiance in their depths. "We wanted to protect our interests, our investments, our vision for the future. We believed we were doing what was best for our countries, for the world." "By prolonging the war?" Kensington asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "By sacrificing millions of lives?" "The war was inevitable," Davies replied, his voice hardening. "We simply managed it. We controlled it. We made sure it served our purposes." "And James?" Margaret finally found her voice, her words choked with emotion. "What about James? He was your friend. He trusted you." Davies looked at her, his eyes filled with a fleeting sadness. "James, he was a good man," he said. "Too good. He stumbled upon our activities. He threatened to expose us. We had no choice." "You ordered his death?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling, tears streaming down her face. Davies hesitated, his gaze shifting away from her. I didn't want him to die," he said. "I tried to dissuade him. I offered him a place with us. But he refused. He was too idealistic, too stubborn." "So you sent Finch," Kensington said, his voice filled with disgust. "You used his own friend to betray him, to kill him." Davies nodded slowly.
"Finch, he was ambitious," he said.
"He saw an opportunity to advance himself. He was easily manipulated." Margaret felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The man she had trusted, the man she had believed would help her, was a monster, a cold-blooded killer who had orchestrated her husband's death and countless others. "You're going to pay for this, Davies," Kensington said, his voice filled with a quiet rage. "You're going to pay for everything you've done." Davies smiled, a chilling, humorless smile. "I think not, Mr. Kensington," he said. "You see, you have no proof. The box, it contains nothing but circumstantial evidence, easily dismissed, easily explained away. And you have no credibility. You're a grieving widow and a disgraced intelligence officer." No one will believe you. He stood up, his tall frame towering over them. I'm afraid this is where our little meeting ends, he said. I have a train to catch. He reached into his coat pocket, and Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. She knew he was reaching for a weapon, a gun, something to silence them, to ensure their silence. But before he could pull it out, Kensington moved. With lightning speed, he lunged across the table, grabbing Davy's wrist, twisting it violently. A small, silver pistol fell from Davy's hand, clattering to the floor. Kensington and Davy struggled, grappling for control of the gun. Margaret, frozen in fear, watched in horror as the two men fought, their bodies locked in a desperate embrace. Suddenly, a shot rang out, deafening in the small room. Margaret screamed, covering her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. When she opened her eyes, she saw Kensington standing over Davies, his own gun smoking in his hand. Davies lay on the floor, his body still, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Kensington had killed him. He had killed Phoenix. He had avenged James's death. But the victory felt hollow, empty. The pain of betrayal, the loss of her husband, the weight of the conspiracy, it was all still there, a crushing burden on her soul. Kensington stood there for a long moment, staring at Davy's body, his face a mask of shock and regret. Then he slowly lowered the gun, his hand trembling. He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. It's over, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's finally over. But it wasn't over. Not really. The circle might be broken, Phoenix might be dead, but the scars of the war, the wounds of betrayal, they would remain. Margaret stood up, her legs shaky, her body trembling. She walked towards Kensington, her eyes drawn to him, to the man who had fought beside her, who had helped her uncover the truth, who had avenged her husband's death. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched into his skin. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken emotion. And then, without a word, he leaned down and kissed her. A stolen kiss, in a moonlit garden that didn't exist, amidst the chaos and carnage of a war that had ended, but whose shadows still lingered. A kiss that was both a farewell and a beginning, a symbol of grief and hope, of loss and love. A kiss that sealed their bond, their shared journey, their uncertain future. The terminal's announcements broke the silence, a hollow and dissonant sound. Chapter 14. The Price of Loyalty and Deception. The kiss lingered, a poignant moment of connection amidst the wreckage of their shattered lives. But the reality of their situation quickly intruded. They were in a private waiting room in Grand Central Terminal, with the body of a powerful senator lying at their feet. They had to act quickly, before they were discovered. We need to leave, Kensington said, his voice hoarse, his eyes scanning the room, his mind already racing, planning their next move. We need to disappear. Margaret nodded, her own mind struggling to process what had just happened. She had come to Washington seeking justice, seeking to expose a conspiracy, and she had found it, but at a terrible cost. They couldn't go to the police.
Not yet.
Davies had been a powerful man, with allies in high places. They couldn't trust anyone. They needed to find a way to get the evidence to the right people, to someone who could ensure that the truth would be revealed, that justice would be served. We need to get the box to someone who can expose everything, Margaret said, her voice trembling. Someone who can't be bought, someone who can't be intimidated. Kensington thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. There's one person, he said. A journalist. A woman named Eleanor Vance. She works for the Washington Post. She's known for her integrity, her relentless pursuit of the truth. She's also been investigating Davies for months, suspecting his involvement in various scandals. Do you think she'll believe us? Margaret asked, her voice filled with doubt. She'll listen, Kensington replied. And she'll know what to do with the evidence. She'll know how to get it to the right people, how to ensure that the truth is revealed. They decided to leave Davies' body where it was. They couldn't risk moving it, couldn't risk being seen. They would leave it to the authorities to find him, to investigate his death. They would focus on getting the evidence to Eleanor Vance, on ensuring that the Circle's conspiracy was exposed. They left the waiting room, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. They moved quickly, stealthily, avoiding the crowds, sticking to the shadows, trying to disappear into the anonymity of the terminal. They reached the main concourse, a vast, cavernous space filled with the hustle and bustle of travelers. They scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of pursuit, any sign of Finch or his accomplices. Suddenly, Margaret saw him. Standing near the information booth, his eyes scanning the crowd, his expression grim, determined. Finch. He hadn't given up. He was still looking for them, still hunting them. Margaret grabbed Kensington's arm, pulling him behind a large pillar, hiding them from Finch's view. He's here, she whispered, her voice trembling. Finch is here. Kensington peered around the pillar, his eyes narrowing. We need to get out of here, he said. He's too close. They decided to take a risk, to use the chaos of the terminal to their advantage. They mingled with the crowd, moving quickly, weaving through the throng of travelers, trying to lose themselves in the mass of humanity. They reached the exit, pushing through the revolving doors, stepping out into the bright sunlight of the city. They hailed a taxi, jumping inside, giving the driver the address of the Washington Post. As the taxi sped away, Margaret looked back at the terminal, her heart pounding. She saw Finch standing on the steps, his face contorted in rage, his eyes searching for them. They had escaped him.
For now.
But they knew he wouldn't give up. He would continue to hunt them, to pursue them, until he had retrieved the box, until he had silenced them. They reached the Washington Post, a large, imposing building in the heart of the city. They paid the driver, hurrying inside, their senses on high alert. They asked for Eleanor Vance, their voices trembling, their hands clutching the wooden box, the evidence that could change everything. They were ushered into a small, cluttered office, where a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor sat behind a desk piled high with papers. Eleanor Vance? Kensington asked, his voice hesitant. The woman nodded, her gaze fixed on them, assessing them, questioning them.
Who are you, and what do you want?
Kensington and Margaret exchanged a look. It was time to reveal the truth, to lay bare the secrets they had carried for so long, to trust this woman with their lives, with James's legacy, with the future. We have a story for you, Miss Vance, Kensington said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. A story about a conspiracy, a betrayal, a murder. A story that will shake this city, this country, to its core. He looked down, his gaze lingering for a moment, and then locked eyes again with Eleanor. A story about a man named Phoenix. Chapter 15. The Ghost of Christmas Past, 1917. Eleanor Vance listened intently, her pen poised over a notepad, her sharp eyes never leaving Kensington's face. He recounted the entire story, from James's discovery of the Circle to Davies's death in Grand Central Terminal. Margaret added details, her voice trembling with emotion as she described James's letters, his journal, his unwavering love for her, and his desperate plea for justice. When they had finished, Eleanor sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. She had heard countless stories of corruption and deceit, of political intrigue and wartime atrocities, but this was something different. This was a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, a betrayal that had cost countless lives, a secret that had been buried for years. You have proof of all this? She asked, her voice skeptical but intrigued. Kensington placed the wooden box on her desk, the centerpiece of their story, the evidence that could bring down an empire of lies. It's all in there, he said. The documents, the letters, the coded ledger, the photograph. Everything you need to expose the Circle, to reveal the truth about Phoenix, to bring justice to James Calloway and countless others. Eleanor opened the box slowly, carefully, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the lid. She examined the contents, her eyes scanning the documents, her brow furrowing in concentration. She read James's journal, her expression softening as she read his words of love for Margaret, his fears for the future, his unwavering determination to expose the truth. She studied the photograph of Finch standing amongst the members of the circle, her eyes narrowing as she recognized some of the faces, men of power and influence, men she had suspected of wrongdoing for years. She spent hours poring over the evidence, questioning Kensington and Margaret, clarifying details, verifying facts. She made phone calls, contacted sources, checked records, her mind racing, piecing together the puzzle, connecting the dots, uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy. As the day wore on, the office grew dark, the only light coming from a single desk lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. Eleanor finally sat back, her face a mixture of shock, anger, and a grim determination. "I believe you," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a steely resolve. "I believe every word you've said, and I'm going to help you expose this. I'm going to help you bring them down." Margaret and Kensington exchanged a look of relief, of gratitude, of hope. They had found someone they could trust, someone who would fight for them, someone who would ensure that the truth was revealed. But Eleanor knew that publishing the story would be dangerous. The circle was powerful, ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. She needed to be careful, to gather more evidence, to corroborate their story, to ensure that she had an airtight case before she went public. "We need to go back," Eleanor said, her voice thoughtful. "We need to retrace James's steps, to find more witnesses, more evidence, more proof." "Go back where?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with apprehension. "To Amiens," Eleanor replied. "To the place where it all began. To the place where James discovered the truth. To the place where he met his betrayer." The thought of returning to Amiens, to the place where she had met James, where they had fallen in love, where their lives had changed forever, filled Margaret with a mixture of dread and longing. She would be revisiting the ghosts of her past, confronting the memories of her lost love, facing the danger that still lurked in the shadows. But she knew she had no choice. She had to do it. For James. For herself. For the future. Eleanor made arrangements, securing travel documents, booking passage on a ship to France. She used her contacts within the newspaper, her connections within the government, to ensure their safety, to provide them with protection. As they prepared to leave, Margaret found herself thinking about Christmas, 1917. Her first Christmas with James, spent in a makeshift hospital near Amiens, surrounded by wounded soldiers, the sounds of shelling echoing in the distance. They had exchanged small gifts, a hand-knitted scarf from Margaret, a collection of poems from James. They had shared a stolen kiss under the mistletoe, a moment of joy amidst the sorrow and suffering of war. It was a memory that had always brought her comfort, a reminder of their love, a beacon of hope in the darkness. But now, it was tinged with sadness, with the knowledge of James's secret life, with the betrayal that had led to his death. As they boarded the ship, bound for France, Margaret clutched James's watch in her hand, the silent timepiece that had started this journey, the watch that had led her to the truth, the watch that now held the memory of their love and the weight of their shared mission. She wondered, as they sailed toward France, if the bitter memories would ever fade. She wondered if she would be strong enough to face what waited for them. Chapter 16. Confronting the Enemy Within. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and arduous, the constant churning of the ship mirroring the turmoil in Margaret's heart. She spent most of her time in her cabin, rereading James's letters and journal, searching for clues, for any hint that might help them in their quest. Kensington, ever watchful, kept a low profile, avoiding contact with the other passengers, his senses on high alert for any sign of danger. Eleanor, meanwhile, used the time to further her investigation, contacting her sources in France, arranging meetings, gathering information. She was a relentless journalist, driven by a thirst for truth and a passion for justice, and she was determined to expose the circle, no matter the cost. As they neared the coast of France, Margaret's anxiety grew. She was returning to a place filled with both beautiful and painful memories, a place where she had found love and lost it, a place where she would confront the ghosts of her past and the dangers of the present. They arrived in Le Havre, a bustling port city still recovering from the ravages of war. The scars of battle were everywhere, in the bombed-out buildings, the shattered streets, the faces of the people, etched with sorrow and resilience. They took a train to Amiens, the city where James and Margaret's paths had first crossed. The journey was a blur of emotions for Margaret, each passing landscape a reminder of her time with James, of their brief, intense romance, of the tragedy that had torn them apart. Amiens was a city transformed. The once familiar streets were now scarred and broken. The field hospital where she had worked was gone, replaced by a makeshift memorial to the fallen. The church where they had been married was still standing, but it was a shell of its former self, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, its stained glass windows shattered. Eleanor had arranged for them to stay in a small, discreet hotel near the city center. She had also arranged for a meeting with a local historian, a man named Monsieur Dubois, who had been researching the war's impact on Amiens and its surrounding areas. Monsieur Dubois was a frail, elderly man, with a sharp mind and a vast knowledge of the region's history. He had heard whispers of the Circle, rumors of their activities in Amiens during the war, but he had lacked concrete evidence. Kensington and Margaret shared their story with him, showing him the documents from the box, explaining James's investigation and Davies's betrayal. Monsieur Dubois listened intently, his eyes widening with each revelation, his frail hands trembling with a mixture of shock and excitement. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have long suspected that something sinister was happening here during the war. But I never imagined the scale of it, the reach of it." He offered to help them, to guide them through the city, to introduce them to people who might have known James, who might have witnessed something, who might have a piece of the puzzle. He led them to the site of the former field hospital, now a barren field, overgrown with weeds. Margaret stood there, her eyes closed, her mind filled with memories of the wounded soldiers, the screams of pain, the smell of antiseptic and blood, the constant presence of death. She remembered James, his gentle hands, his kind eyes, his unwavering compassion. She remembered their stolen moments together, their shared laughter, their whispered promises, their love that had blossomed amidst the horrors of war. Monsieur Dubois pointed to a small, crumbling building on the edge of the field, a former supply depot. That building it was used as an interrogation center during the war, he said. It was rumored that unspeakable things happened there. Kensington's eyes narrowed. "Interrogation center?" he repeated. "Could that be where he betrayed James?" Monsieur Dubois nodded slowly. "It's possible," he said. "It's said that the German officer Klaus Richter, the one who gave your husband the code name Phoenix, he was held there before he died. They decided to investigate the building. It was a dangerous proposition, venturing into a place with a dark and violent past, but they had to do it. They had to find out what had happened there, to uncover any remaining traces of the Circle's activities." As they approached the building, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, familiar figure, his face hidden by the brim of a hat, his hand gripping a gun. Finch. He had found them. He had followed them to Amiens, his pursuit relentless, his determination unwavering. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice cold, menacing. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist the ghosts of your past." Margaret and Kensington froze, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. They were trapped, cornered, facing the enemy within, the man who had betrayed James, the man who had haunted their steps since that fateful night in New York. The confrontation was inevitable, the culmination of their journey, the final battle for truth and justice. And from the shadows behind Finch came another figure. Chapter 17. A desperate plea for forgiveness. The figure emerging from the shadows behind Finch was not who Margaret or Kensington expected. It was a woman, elderly but strikingly elegant, with silver hair perfectly coiffed and piercing blue eyes that mirrored those of the late Senator Davies. She wore a tailored suit, expensive and impeccably clean, a stark contrast to the crumbling, war-torn surroundings. "Alistair," she said, her voice calm but firm, her tone carrying an undeniable authority. "Put the gun down." Finch hesitated, his gaze flickering between the woman and Margaret, his face a mixture of confusion and defiance. But Mrs. Davies, he stammered. They have the box. They know everything. I know what they have, Mrs. Davies replied, her voice unwavering. And I know what you've done. It's over, Alistair. It's all over. Margaret and Kensington watched in stunned silence, their minds struggling to comprehend this unexpected turn of events. Mrs. Davies, the widow of the man they had believed to be Phoenix, was here in Amiens confronting Finch, seemingly on their side.
Who are you?
Margaret asked, her voice trembling, her eyes fixed on the woman. Mrs. Davies turned to her, her expression softening slightly, a hint of sadness in her eyes. My name is Eleanor Davies, she said. And I am, or rather, I was Alistair's wife. But more importantly, I was James Calloway's sister. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. James's sister? She had never known he had a sister. He had never mentioned her, never spoken of his family. I don't understand, Margaret stammered. James never, he didn't know, Mrs. Davies interrupted, her voice filled with a deep sorrow. He was estranged from our family. He disapproved of our father's business dealings, of Alistair's ambitions. He cut all ties with us when he enlisted. She explained that she had learned of James's death years ago through a private investigator she had hired to track him down. She had grieved for him in secret, unable to reveal her connection to him, fearing the consequences. When I learned of Alistair's death, she continued, and the circumstances surrounding it, I knew I had to do something. I had to find out the truth. I had to atone for my family's sins. She had followed Finch to Amiens, knowing he would lead her to Margaret and Kensington, knowing he would lead her to the evidence that could expose the circle, that could finally bring justice to James. Alistair, he was a weak man, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of contempt and pity. He was seduced by power, by greed. He became a monster. But he wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't Phoenix. Then who is? Kensington asked, his voice urgent, his eyes searching Mrs. Davies' face. She hesitated, her gaze shifting to the crumbling interrogation center, to the dark secrets hidden within its walls. The truth is more complicated than you know, she said. Phoenix, it wasn't a single person. It was a collective, a group of individuals, all working together, all sharing the same goals, the same ambitions. She revealed that the circle had been formed long before the war, by a group of powerful families, industrialists, and politicians who sought to control the world's resources, to manipulate governments, to shape the future to their liking. The war had been merely a tool, a means to an end. Alistair was a part of it, she said. But he was just a pawn, a small player in a much larger game. The real power lay elsewhere. She explained that the evidence in the box, the documents, the letters, the coded ledger, they were all pieces of the puzzle, but they didn't reveal the full picture. There was more, much more, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. I need your help, she said, her voice pleading, her eyes filled with a desperate hope. I need your help to expose them, to bring them all to justice, to finally end this cycle of violence, of greed, of betrayal. Margaret and Kensington exchanged a look. They had come to Amiens seeking answers, seeking revenge, seeking closure. And they had found it, but not in the way they had expected. They had found an unlikely ally, a woman who had been wronged by her own family, a woman who was seeking redemption, a woman who was willing to risk everything to expose the truth. They agreed to help her. They would work together, combining their knowledge, their resources, their determination, to unravel the remaining secrets of the circle, to bring the true masterminds to justice. But first they had to deal with Finch. He was still standing there, his gun lowered but not holstered, his face a mask of confusion and despair. Alistair, Mrs. Davies said, her voice firm but gentle. It's over. Give me the gun. And then, please, tell us what happened to Klaus. There would be no forgiveness, but perhaps, in telling the truth, there could be a start toward redemption. Chapter 18. The Reckoning at the Docks. Finch's surrender was anticlimactic. He handed the gun to Mrs. Davies, his shoulders slumping, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and relief. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. He looked older than his years, the weight of his betrayal, his crimes, finally crushing him. He confessed everything. He told them about his recruitment into the Circle, his role in James's betrayal, his orders to retrieve the box, to silence Margaret and Kensington. He spoke of his fear, his greed, his ambition, his gradual descent into darkness. He also revealed the details of Klaus Richter's final days, confirming that the German officer had indeed been held and interrogated at the former supply depot. He described Richter's courage, his defiance, his unwavering belief in justice, even in the face of death. He knew he was going to die, Finch said, his voice barely a whisper. But he wasn't afraid. He said he had made a promise. A promise to expose the truth. A promise to end the war. Richter had given James the codename Phoenix, not as a single person, but as a symbol of the Circle itself, a Hydra-like organization that would rise again from the ashes, even if one head was severed. Finch's confession, while providing closure, didn't offer any new leads in their pursuit of the remaining members of the Circle. Mrs. Davies, however, had a plan.
"We need to go to Paris," she said.
"That's where the real power lies. That's where the decisions were made. That's where we'll find the remaining members of the Circle." She explained that her family had connections in Paris, powerful connections, people who could help them, people who could provide them with information, with access, with protection. They left Finch in the custody of Monsieur Dubois, who promised to contact the local authorities to ensure that he would be brought to justice. Margaret felt no satisfaction in his capture, only a deep sadness for the man he had become, for the choices he had made. They traveled to Paris by train, the journey a somber reflection of the events that had unfolded. Margaret found herself thinking about James, about their brief, intense romance, about the life they had planned together, the future that had been stolen from them. She realized that she had been holding on to a fantasy, an idealized image of James, a hero without flaws. But the truth was more complex, more nuanced. He had been a good man, a brave man, but he had also been a flawed man, a man who had made mistakes, who had kept secrets, who had been caught in a web of deceit and betrayal. She was finally beginning to see him, not as a ghost, not as a symbol, but as a real person, with all his strengths and weaknesses. And she was finally beginning to let go of the past, to embrace the present, to look towards the future. They arrived in Paris, a city of lights and shadows, a city of beauty and intrigue, a city that held the key to unraveling the remaining secrets of the Circle. Mrs. Davies led them to a luxurious apartment in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, a safe haven where they could plan their next move. She introduced them to a network of contacts, people who had been wronged by the Circle, people who had been silenced, people who were seeking revenge. They were journalists, politicians, businessmen, former intelligence officers, all united by a common goal, to expose the Circle and bring its members to justice. They spent days gathering information, piecing together the puzzle, connecting the dots, identifying the remaining members of the Circle, uncovering their hidden agendas, their secret dealings. They discovered that the Circle was still active, still manipulating events, still controlling governments, still profiting from war and conflict. They were a Hydra-like organization, as Richter had described, with many heads, many tentacles, reaching into every corner of society. They decided to focus on one key member, a powerful financier named Jean-Luc Montaigne, a man who had been close to Davies, a man who was rumored to be the new leader of the Circle. They planned a daring operation, a sting to expose Montaigne, to gather evidence of his crimes, to bring him to justice. They would use Mrs. Davies's connections, her insider knowledge, to gain access to him, to set a trap. The operation was risky, dangerous, but they had no choice. They had to do it. For James. For themselves. For the future. They met with Montaigne at a private club near the docks, a place where he was known to conduct his secret dealings. Mrs. Davies introduced Margaret and Kensington as potential investors, interested in his latest venture, a lucrative arms deal. Montaigne was a charming, sophisticated man, with a smooth demeanor and a keen eye for business. He welcomed them, offering them champagne, engaging them in conversation, trying to win their trust. But Margaret and Kensington saw through his facade, saw the darkness beneath the surface, the greed, the ruthlessness, the utter disregard for human life. As they talked, Mrs. Davies subtly steered the conversation towards the circle, towards Davies, towards the war. Montaigne became increasingly uncomfortable, his smile fading, his eyes narrowing, his guard rising. He realized that he was being trapped, that he was being exposed. He tried to dismiss their questions, to change the subject, to deflect their accusations. But it was too late. Kensington had activated a hidden recording device, capturing Montaigne's every word, his every admission, his every lie. Suddenly, the doors of the club burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in. They were not police officers. They were Montaigne's men, his bodyguards, his enforcers. A gunfight erupted, the sounds of gunfire and shattering glass filling the room. Margaret and Kensington found themselves caught in the crossfire, trapped in a deadly battle for survival. They had expected resistance, but nothing could have prepared them for the heart-stopping shootout. Chapter 19. Unveiling the secret of the Calloway estate. The chaos of the gunfight at the docks was disorienting. Margaret and Kensington took cover behind an overturned table, the sounds of bullets whizzing past their heads, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Mrs. Davies, surprisingly agile for her age, had managed to find refuge behind a large, ornate bar. Kensington returned fire, his aim steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was a trained soldier, accustomed to the violence of war, but Margaret was not. She huddled beside him, her hands covering her ears, her eyes squeezed shut, her body trembling. The battle was fierce but short-lived. Montaigne's men, though well-armed, were no match for Kensington's experience, and the unexpected arrival of several men who identified themselves as associates of Eleanor Vance alerted to the danger by a prearranged signal. Montaigne was killed in the crossfire, his body slumped on the floor, his secrets silenced forever. The aftermath was a blur of sirens, police officers, and flashing lights. Margaret and Kensington, along with Mrs. Davies, were taken into custody, questioned for hours, their story met with skepticism and disbelief. But Eleanor Vance, true to her word, had been working behind the scenes. She had used her connections, her influence, to ensure that their story was heard, that the evidence was examined, that the truth was revealed. The recording of Montaigne's confession, along with the documents from the box, proved to be irrefutable proof of the circle's existence and its crimes. The story broke, making headlines around the world, shaking governments, toppling empires, exposing a conspiracy that had spanned decades. The remaining members of the circle were hunted down, arrested, brought to justice. The organization was dismantled, its assets seized, its secrets laid bare. The world was shocked, outraged, but also relieved. The truth had finally prevailed. Margaret and Kensington were exonerated, hailed as heroes, their bravery and determination lauded by the press and the public. But for Margaret, the victory was bittersweet. She had found justice for James, she had exposed the circle, but she had also lost so much. She decided to return to New York, to the brownstone on East 20th Street, to the place where her journey had begun. She needed to find closure, to rebuild her life, to move on from the past. Mrs. Davies, now a close friend and confidant, accompanied her. She had decided to sell her family's estate in France and start anew, dedicating her life to atoning for her family's sins, to supporting the victims of war and conflict. As Margaret stepped back into the familiar surroundings of her home, she felt a sense of both sadness and relief. The house was filled with memories of James, of their life together, of the tragedy that had shattered their dreams. She went to the parlor, to the mantelpiece where James's watch still sat, silent, a constant reminder of their love and loss. She picked it up, holding it in her hands, feeling its weight, its history, its connection to the past. As she examined the watch, she noticed something she had overlooked before. A small inscription on the back, beneath James's name and regiment, and beneath the hidden compartment she had already discovered. It was barely visible, etched into the metal with a delicate hand. She held the watch closer to the light, squinting her eyes, trying to decipher the inscription. It was a series of letters and numbers, a code. Her heart leaped with excitement. Could it be? Could there be another secret, another hidden message, another piece of the puzzle? She remembered James's journal, his fascination with codes and ciphers, his love of secrets and mysteries. She remembered his words, the watch, the time, the date. The answer lies within. She realized that she had only deciphered part of the code, the part related to the circle. But there was more, much more, hidden within the watch. She worked tirelessly, using all her knowledge, all her intuition, to crack the code. She tried various combinations of letters and numbers, dates and times, keywords and phrases. Finally, after hours of effort, she found it. The code revealed a location, a specific place, Calloway Estate, Cornwall, England.
Cornwall.
James's ancestral home, the place he had spoken of so often, the place he had dreamed of returning to with her. He had inherited the estate from his father, but he had never been able to claim it. The war intervening, his life cut short. Margaret knew she had to go there. She had to uncover the final secret, the last piece of the puzzle, the truth that James had hidden for her. She and Mrs. Davies booked passage on a ship to England, their hearts filled with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. They were embarking on a new journey, a new quest, a new adventure. As they sailed towards England, Margaret held James's watch close to her heart, the silent timepiece now holding a new promise, a new hope, a new beginning. A chapter was closing on one part of her life and opening on another. Chapter 20. A new dawn, a new beginning. The journey to Cornwall was a pilgrimage of sorts, a return to James's roots, a search for the final piece of his legacy. The Calloway Estate was a sprawling property, nestled amidst rolling hills and rugged coastline, a place of ancient beauty and timeless charm. The house itself was a grand manor, imposing yet welcoming, filled with the echoes of generations past. Margaret and Mrs. Davies were greeted by the estate's caretaker, a kindly old man named Mr. Tremaine, who had served the Calloway family for decades. He had been expecting them, alerted to their arrival by a letter from Eleanor Vance, who had once again used her influence to smooth their path. Mr. Tremaine showed them around the house, pointing out portraits of James's ancestors, sharing stories of his childhood, his love of the sea, his passion for poetry. Margaret listened intently, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and longing, piecing together a picture of the man she had loved, the man she had lost, the man she was still discovering. The house was filled with his presence, his books, his writings, his personal belongings, all carefully preserved by Mr. Tremaine, awaiting his return. It was as if he had just stepped out for a moment, as if he would walk back in at any time, his smile bright, his eyes filled with love. Margaret asked about the secret, the hidden message in the watch, the location it revealed. Mr. Tremaine looked puzzled, shaking his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't know of any secrets, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "I've lived here all my life. I know every nook and cranny of this estate. There's nothing hidden here." But Margaret was not convinced. She knew James. She knew his love of mysteries, his penchant for hiding things, his desire to protect her, to guide her, even from beyond the grave. She spent days searching the house, exploring every room, every corridor, every closet, every drawer. She examined the books, the paintings, the furniture, the tapestries, searching for any clue, any hint, any sign of a hidden compartment, a secret passage, a hidden message. Mrs. Davies helped her, her own determination fueled by a desire to honor James's memory, to uncover the final truth, to find closure for Margaret and for herself. They searched the library, the study, the drawing room, the dining room, the bedrooms, the attic, the cellar, the stables, the gardens, the grounds. They found nothing. Margaret was beginning to despair, to believe that she had been wrong, that the code in the watch had been a mistake, a coincidence, a figment of her imagination. She went to James's study, a room filled with his books, his writings, his personal belongings. She sat at his desk, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of the wood, her eyes scanning the shelves, the walls, the floor. She noticed a small, wooden box on the desk, similar to the one that had contained the evidence of the circle. She opened it, her heart pounding with anticipation. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single key. A large, ornate key, unlike any she had seen before. She looked around the room, her eyes searching for a lock, a door, a chest, anything that the key might fit. And then she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible line in the paneling on the wall behind the desk, a hairline crack in the wood. It was so subtle, so well concealed, that it was almost invisible. She carefully inserted the key into the crack, and with a soft click, a section of the paneling sprang open, revealing a hidden compartment. Her heart leaped with excitement. She had found it. She had found James's final secret. Inside the compartment, she found a single, leather-bound book. She carefully lifted it out, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears. It was a journal, James's final journal, written in the months before his death. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages, her heart aching with each entry. He wrote of his love for her, his longing for their reunion, his fears for the future. He wrote of his investigation, his discovery of the circle, his decision to hide the evidence, his plan to expose them. And then she found it. The final entry, written just days before he was injured at Argonne. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means that I am gone, and that my worst fears have come to pass. I have hidden the truth, the final piece of the puzzle, in a place where only you can find it. It is my legacy to you, my final gift, my last hope. The circle is more than just a conspiracy, Margaret. It is an ancient evil, a force that has shaped history, that has controlled empires, that has caused countless wars and conflicts. It is a hydra with many heads, many tentacles, reaching into every corner of society. I have discovered their ultimate goal, their final plan, their endgame. They seek to control not just governments, not just economies, but the very fabric of reality itself. They seek to rewrite history, to reshape the world in their image, to create a new world order, a world ruled by fear, by greed, by power. The key to stopping them lies in understanding their origins, their beliefs, their rituals. It lies in uncovering the ancient secrets, the forgotten knowledge, the hidden truths that they have sought to suppress for centuries. I have learned that they are not new, and that others before me tried to reveal them. The fight is never over, not really. But the war is, and I am so grateful to have known you, to have loved you. You have a chance at a future I cannot share. I love you, Margaret. Always and forever.
James.
The journal slipped from her numb fingers. The revelation was staggering, terrifying. The circle was not just a group of corrupt businessmen and politicians, it was something far more sinister, far more ancient, far more powerful. Margaret looked at Mrs. Davies, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. It's not over, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's never been over. Mrs. Davies nodded, her own face pale but resolute. We know, she said. And we know what we have to do. They had uncovered James's final secret, they had discovered the truth about the circle, but they had also awakened a new challenge, a new battle, a new fight for the future. They had a choice to make. They could walk away, try to forget what they had learned, try to live a normal life, a life free from fear, from danger, from responsibility. Or they could fight. They could continue James's legacy. They could take up his cause. They could dedicate their lives to exposing the circle, to stopping their evil plan, to saving the world. They looked at each other, their eyes meeting, their hearts united. They knew what they had to do. They would fight. They would continue the fight for James, for themselves, for the future. A new dawn was breaking. A new beginning was emerging. A new chapter was unfolding. And they were ready.
Epilogue.
Years passed. The sun-drenched fields of Cornwall replaced the smoke-filled rooms of wartime intrigue. Margaret, no longer the grieving widow, but a woman forged anew by fire and truth, stood on the cliffs overlooking the turbulent sea. Beside her stood Arthur Kensington, his silver hair now almost white, his shoulders still broad, his presence a comforting constant. Eleanor Davies, having found a purpose beyond her family's tainted legacy, had returned to America, a fierce advocate for peace and justice, her pen mightier than any sword. The Calloway estate had become a sanctuary, not just for Margaret and Arthur, but for others who had been scarred by the war, by the Circle's machinations. They had established a foundation dedicated to uncovering and combating hidden injustices, to supporting those who had been silenced, to ensuring that the lessons of the past were not forgotten. The fight against the deeper, ancient evil that James had revealed in his final journal was a subtle, ongoing one. It was not a battle fought with guns and bombs, but with knowledge, with vigilance, with a steadfast commitment to truth and justice. Margaret and Arthur, guided by James's legacy and supported by a network of like-minded individuals, worked tirelessly to expose the tendrils of the Circle's influence wherever they found them, in politics, in finance, in education, in the media. They never truly eradicated the Hydra, but they kept it at bay, preventing it from ever again gaining the kind of power it had wielded during the war. They understood that the fight for freedom, for justice, for peace, was a never-ending one, a constant struggle against the forces of darkness. Margaret often visited the small, local churchyard, where a simple stone marker bore James's name, a reminder of his sacrifice, his love, his enduring spirit. She would sit beside his grave, sharing her day, her thoughts, her triumphs, and her struggles. She no longer heard the phantom ticking of his watch. She carried his memory in her heart, a steady, unwavering rhythm that guided her every step. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sea, Margaret and Arthur stood together on the cliffs, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. They had grown old together, their lives intertwined, their bond forged in the crucible of shared loss and shared purpose. Arthur gently took Margaret's hand, his touch warm and familiar. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. They had found a different kind of love, a love born of respect, of companionship, of a shared commitment to a cause greater than themselves. It was not the passionate, whirlwind romance she had shared with James, but it was deep, it was enduring, it was real. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret felt a sense of peace, of contentment, of fulfillment. She had lived a life filled with both sorrow and joy, with loss and love, with tragedy and triumph. She had faced her demons, she had overcome her fears, she had found her purpose. She had honored James's memory, she had kept his legacy alive, she had made a difference in the world. And she knew, with a certainty that warmed her soul, that he would be proud of her. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of the sea, the promise of a new day, a new dawn, a new beginning. She was ready. She had always been ready. She and the world. The end.